Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're going to begin our 15th annual gathering with another in-depth look at the Billy Meier case. Briefly, why is this case so important? Why, after all these decades, does it continue to generate controversy? Indeed. Our first presenter is going to be Wendelle Stevens. Wendelle needs no introduction, but let me just say a few words. Wendelle was there, first person. He experienced many high strangeness paranormal events surrounding the Billy Meier case. Stuff that in no way could it possibly happen without literally otherworldly intervention. This case is real, folks, and if you've ever had any doubts about it by the conclusion of this 4 hours tonight, I think your doubts will vanish. Ladies and gentlemen, Wendelle.
Hi, Bob. Nice to see so many old friends here. You know, people still ask me, they come up to me, even here today, and say, do you really believe in this Meier case? And I only have one. The first thing I think of is, oh, is he uninformed? And then I think, if he only had all the information that I have, he wouldn't be asking the question in the first place. So I decided I'd try to tell you why I believe the case, and why I believe it could not be anything else but a real case.
Wendelle Stevens, retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. He worked as test pilot for the Air Technical Intelligence Center. He had some participation in the Blue Book project. After leaving the Air Force, he was investigating UFO activity, and he had one of the largest collections of UFO photographs in the world, with more than 3,000 samples. He documented 22 extraterrestrial activity cases. He wrote several books about this phenomenon.
Surprised to see the jacket was an American Air Force B-4 aviation jacket. Had the blue mouton collar, blue furry collar, fake furry collar. They put that on him because it was still raining out, not heavy, but light rain. And they were looking for some headgear for him that wouldn't get wet, wouldn't take water. And all the people there worked out and came in from work about 6 o'clock or 6:15. The women set out the table for dinner, and the men ate, and they washed their hands, then came to the table and ate. They all knew what was happening. They saw him standing there all dressed and ready to go with his walkie-talkie over his shoulder on one side and his .44 pistol on the other, strapped on his side, and polished shoes and clean clothes all ready to go. And they finished, and the women started gathering up the plates on the tables when he got his signal, apparently, because he waved his hand in a little kind of a salute like that and started out the kitchen door. That kitchen door went out 2 steps down to a landing in a lean-to shed like that, and down to the ground. There was about 10 or 12 steps from that to the end door opening out to the outside, and that was closed with a spring, a flexible spring. So when he signaled and started out the door, I set my coffee cup down so hard I splashed the coffee, ran around the table and out in front of the stove where he had been standing and out the door. And as I came around the table, I looked up at a big round-faced clock over the cook stove there, a wood cook stove, and I saw that it was 8:25. And I remembered the time because that's exactly what this big round-faced clock said. And I started out the door behind him. I got down, kitchen door open and down on the ground about just a few steps behind Bill, in time to see the outside door closing on his heels. So I ran the 8 or so steps as fast as I could, jerked the door open. I want to see him go, even if I can't accompany him. I want to see him picked up how they do it. And when I pulled the door open, it's quiet out there. No flashing lights, no sound, no nothing but the raindrops bouncing in little puddles all over the place. And there was 3 steps in the mud with the mud squished out. 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. No 4th step. The water was just beginning to run back into the footsteps where the mud had been squished out, and raindrops were bouncing in little puddles all around, just light raindrops there. But perfectly quiet, no flashing lights, no evidence of nothing. And I stayed out there waiting to see if anything would develop, and I got soaking wet. And I went in and changed clothes, and I came down. Somebody gave me a raincoat to protect me this time when I went out. But the kitchen was quiet. The people inside were quiet. The Germans had gone into the living room. They're all standing around in front of the television set there looking at it. So I went in and looked over the shoulder to see what they're looking at, and it was a black screen with a white cross on it that said in German, "The Papa has died, the Pope has died, has passed." And I said, "How did he die?" They said, "There's been no announcement. The program just stopped, and this came up on the screen." Then about that time, they started some dirge music, low dirge music, funeral music on the TV. So I watched it for a couple of minutes and then went back outside. I don't want to miss him coming back. I missed him going. And I was standing out there in the rain. About a half an hour, 45 minutes later, the telephone rang. Now, he got a walkie-talkie, so he could tell them when he was down by radio, wherever he was. But this phone rang. Somebody upstairs answered the phone and raised the window and hollered out at me and said, "He's down. He's over on the other side of the mountain, and you can go with Jacobus and his wife to pick him up." And I thought, on the other side of the mountain, what's he carrying a radio for if he's talking on the telephone? Turned out that the radio was line of sight transmission, and the mountain was in the way. So he had to use a telephone. He went to a local guest house. So we got on Jacobus black Volkswagen at the time, and splishing and splashing through the mud puddles around mountain roads, unfinished mountain roads. They were dirt roads with pockets in them full of water, and finally got to the guest house on the other side of the mountain. And there's Billy standing on the outside fire exit door under a 3-board roof, a little roof. And he was waiting for us to show up, and he was bone dry. He didn't have any water on his jacket, didn't have any water on his head, his shoes didn't have any mud on the tops of his shoes, just a little bit on the soles where the mud had squished out. And he got in the car. He looked very solemn, and he got in the car. And I was trying to make conversation with him, and I said, "Have you heard the news?" He didn't respond. I said, about the Pope, he died. He didn't respond to that, and I said, there's been no announcement. Nobody knows how he died. He turned around slowly and said, his pump. Then he turned back. I said, heart attack? He shook his head and said no, and he didn't want to answer that. So when we got back to Billy's house, about 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, we went inside, and the Germans all went into the living room and closed the door, meaning that they were going to have a private discussion. And I was out in the kitchen, so I poured me some more coffee and sat down at the table and started to wait. Nobody came out, and nobody came out for a long time, and after midnight I decided I'll go up and get some sleep. I'll find out in the morning. So I did. And I got up early there, and I went down, made me a cup of coffee, and I sat there and drank coffee and listened to the birds outside, and a young woman came down the stairs from up the upper level and met us, and I said, what time did the meeting break up last night? She shook her head and said, not last night. I said, well, when? She said, 6 o'clock this morning. I thought, oh, man, it'd be a long time before Billy gets up. Can you tell me what happened? He said, oh, I can't tell you. He'll tell you. So I waited some more, and he got up about 9:30. And they fixed him a cup of coffee, and we started to sit down at the kitchen table and drink it, and he jerked his head like that for me to follow him. And we went outside and sat on the patio at a metal table, with a patio table with a glass top and iron chairs around it. And I said, gee, Billy, can you tell me what happened last night? He thought a minute, and he looked up and looked me straight in the eye, and he said, I watched them murder the Pope. I said, murder the Pope? We don't murder popes these days. That's old historical stuff. It just doesn't happen in modern times. He looked up at me again, and he said, I watched them murder the Pope. I said, oh, that's unbelievable, unbelievable. He said, I watched it all on viewing screens. He said, we got there 5 or 10 minutes before. We watched that Pope's manservant prepared a warm tea before he got in bed each night, Pope Paul VI. And the first scene they showed Billy was the manservant in the kitchen in the Vatican preparing the tray with the warm tea on it for the Pope. And there was a cardinal standing there with his hands in his pockets of his cassock, just watching what was going on. Nothing was being said. And the manservant got the tray ready, got the tea ready, and put some lemon on it, got it all ready. And he noticed he didn't have a napkin, so he motioned to the cardinal like that and went out of the room and into another closet room to get a napkin for the tray. While he was gone, Billy saw that cardinal take a little bottle out of the pocket of his cassock, unstop it, put 2 drops of liquid into the tea, then stop it, put it back in his cassock pocket. When the manservant got back, the Pope, that cardinal was standing the same way he was before. And the manservant didn't notice anything. He took the tea in and put it on the bedside table for Pope Paul VI, and Billy saw all this on another viewing screen. And then he left the room. And then the scene switched back to the cardinal standing in the kitchen. The manservant started putting things away. The cardinal stood there for 4 or 5 minutes and then looked at a clock and then walked back and looked in the Pope's room. And apparently satisfied, he closed the door carefully and went to the Pope's office and picked up a folder that was laying on the Pope's desk, ready for an announcement to be made the following morning. He put the folder on his arm and walked out with it. And they didn't show him where it went, but they told him he's protesting that we don't do this too. And they showed a scene. Billy was protesting, and Semyasi said this Pope had discovered the Vatican losses through the Vatican treasury, hundreds of millions of dollars, and he was going to announce the losses and appoint a commission to investigate it. And she said the commission to investigate it would have involved some of the perpetrators, some of those involved in the loss, and they couldn't have this come to light because it would cost them their careers and possibly their lives. So 3 or 4 co-conspirators together arranged to get the Pope out of the picture before he could make the announcement and make off with the announcement. And that was what happened. So Billy's telling me this. I'm still protesting that we don't murder popes. This is a modern time. It just doesn't happen. He said, well, I can tell you something else that you can watch for. He said, they showed me that the next pope, his successor, would be elected on the largest conclave in the history of the church. Of course, there's more cardinals. It would be elected on the shortest ballot. And in my research, I found there was only one other ballot that short. He'd be elected on the third ballot. It'll take 33 days to verify the ballot. They evidently poll the cardinals that vote. They verify the ballot, and they said the new pope will take the name. They gave Billy the name that the newly elected pope would be, his given name. And then they said when he was crowned pope, he would take the name John Paul I. And then they added that this pope will discover the losses and begin the process all over again, and the co-conspirators act once more, and he'll die by the same hands for the same reason in exactly 33 days, the same minutes it took to poll a vote. Now, that's something I could check, and this is only there hasn't even been a proper announcement about the pope that was just died. So I made notes of that, and but I'm still protesting, and Billy said he's trying to reinforce his position. So he said, again, I can tell you something else, Mr. Stevens. He said, after the short-term pope that will reign 33 days, he will perish by the same hands. He said, then the cardinals, the Vatican hierarchy is still in charge of the Vatican. And the hierarchy will decide to elect a pope outside of the Vatican hierarchy, so he has less chance of finding out what's going on. And they gave Billy the name of the second pope to follow Pope John Paul I. Hasn't even been elected yet. They said that second pope will be Cardinal something Wasinski. It was Pope John Paul II's given name before he became a cardinal or became the pope. And they said that he will have a choice. After he's crowned pope, he will discover the loss, and he'll have a choice. Either he has to do the right thing and act and suffer the same fate or risk the same fate, or he's going to have to ignore it and do nothing about it until he can get some better control in the Vatican. And apparently John Paul II decided to do that. They told Billy that new pope from Poland would choose the name John Paul II in honor of the first short-lived pope, the 33-day pope. And he's telling me all of this before any of it happened in reality. And I'm making notes. I've got pages of notes, and he told me more about what would happen after that. He said that the church is near its end anyway. It doesn't have long before it collapses of its own weight. And he said that John Paul II, after he's elected, the Vatican hierarchy, still in charge of affairs in the Vatican, will keep him on the road as much as they can. And they said he may become known as the traveling pope, the smiling pope, but he will be exposed to the public much more than any of the other popes before him. Now remember what happened, who this guy was and how he lived his life. He traveled a lot because the Vatican hierarchy kept him on the road. Now I was so disturbed by what he's telling me, and he got called to the telephone, and then he had to go on and do something else, and he didn't come back. And I'm sitting there pondering all of this and thinking, this just can't happen. This is a modern world. And a German journalist that had been sitting in his car waiting to talk to Billy came over to say something. First of all, he wanted to know how you could get in touch with Billy. And I said that I don't know where he went, but he was here a few minutes ago. And I'm sitting there, and he's wanting to ask me some questions about the case. And I said, you say you're a journalist. Who do you work for? And he said, Blick magazine. That's a German news magazine, like Newsweek. I said, there's a bigger story here than you ever imagined. And I started to tell him what Billy had just told me. And I know that I shouldn't have told anybody this because Billy wasn't ready for me to go blabbing it anywhere. But I couldn't resist. I just, it was beyond me. So I told this young man that he should check into the death of the Pope. have doctors examine it, find out what really happened, because this is the information I have. He didn't believe it either. And then I told him that the added information that his successor will be elected on a short ballot. He'll reign. It takes 33 days to verify it. He'll live the same number of days and die with the same hands for the same reason. He said, "Oh man," he said, "I can get me a job in the Vatican. I can get my magazine to get myself or somebody else a job in the magazine, and we can watch events and do some investigating on Pope John Paul." I said, "I sure would recommend that, because this kind of stuff shouldn't be going on in the world. This is really diabolic." And he said, "I agree." He said, I'll get something done. Don't you worry." Now, if you'll bring that book cover up on the screen here, a couple of years later, I got a letter from the guy. He was telling me that they had investigated the case and the book was in writing. Have you got the book cover back there? Okay. So the caller directed me to this book and said, we got a man in the Vatican working there on a Vatican assignment. He was an employee in the Vatican, and he was trying to investigate the death of Pope John Paul I when the other Pope died, the same way. So now he had fresh clues and fresh information, and he investigated the death of Pope John Paul I and wrote this book, In God's Name. I don't see it on the screen yet, but it was published by Ballantine Books in this country in English, in paperback. There it is. It's in paperback and hardcover. This is a copy of the hardcover version. I only have one with me. But that describes in detail who the perpetrators were, why they had to do away with the Pope, what would happen to them if that Pope was allowed to continue, and also showing that John Paul had a choice to make that he hadn't made yet. And that was very interesting.